Alberta Primetime with Michael Higgins.
Welcome to Alberta Primetime. Ahead tonight, our politics panel on efforts at Calgary City Hall to boost transparency on lobbying. But first, flushing out the details.
Whether and to what extent this project will go ahead, I think, is still very much up in the air. There does seem to be some agreement to move it forward in some capacity, sort of in the next 10 years, but there's a lot of time between now and 2035.
Environmental sector reaction to a new memorandum of understanding reached between Alberta and the federal government and 5 oil sands players in the oil sands. A non-binding agreement paving the way to increased production of crude and notably advancing the Pathways Carbon Capture Project, a key condition for Alberta's proposed pipeline to the West Coast. And joining us now, the Federal Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Tim Hodgson. Minister Hodgson, sir, welcome to Alberta Primetime.
It's nice to be here.
All right. After several years of discussions over the Pathways project, what did it take to get From pushing pathways forward to First Nations, raising concerns over major projects, and the Mayor of Calgary's push for a lobbyist registry. Time now for tonight's politics panel. And joining us this evening, Najib Judd, political advisor and brand strategist. He's worked on election campaigns at every level of government here and abroad. And Don Hill, co-founder of the blog Beyond Polarity, longtime broadcast journalist in Alberta as well. Good evening to you both. And let's begin with this month of major project developments in our province, including news this week that an MOU was signed July 2nd, setting a course for the Pathways Carbon Capture Project, an agreement we discussed with the federal Minister of Energy and Natural Resources off the top. Najib, how much do you see the federal government having to either give up or bend on to get those 5 oil sands companies involved, to bite on pathways?
Well, you know, whenever corporations agree to something, you always have to look at how they're benefiting from it. It was interesting that the minister said that we can't pick and choose, what to criticize in the MOU, but we also can't pick and choose what not or what to disregard. It's amazing to me that we continue to subsidize large oil and gas companies on their operating expenses, what should be a cost of business. Carbon capture, emissions, protecting the environment, this should be a cost of doing business for them. But we continue to use taxpayer money to subsidize this for them and continue letting them, move the goalposts. They said originally that they were going to capture 22 megatons of emissions before 2030. Now it's 6 megatons before mid-30s. And all we're doing is subsidizing their operating expenses. It's interesting to me, some of the minister's words, like, how this benefits shareholders, how this creates new GDP, but, no mention of creating new jobs, which, we haven't seen a lot of that happening with the oil and gas sector.
Don, after the departure of Stephen Guilbeault, is there enough here with this Pathways MOU for the Prime Minister to keep peace within his own caucus where climate action is concerned?
Well, I'm going to differ from my colleague Najib here in this space because of 2 reasons. One, when we heard from the minister, what we heard or didn't hear is that we're in a dynamic situation. So people will often in business tell you what you want to hear, knowing full well that things will change, as you say, the goalposts in about 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years. We're in a global conflict situation now, friends. I don't mean to rain on your parade, although it's been raining a lot lately. And as you heard from the minister, India, other partners in this confederation of allies are starting to wonder about energy security. And we have a lot of conversations in our country about what that means, but we're not getting down to the dynamic situations that maybe we won't need carbon capture at all within 2 to 3 years because the situation has changed. Now, I realize that opens up a can of worms. But seriously, friends, we have to start to think about this. If we're the only country in the world that Mr. Guilbeault wanted to completely paralyze with oil production, then if we're the only country in the world that's doing carbon capture, who's being foolish here when a global conflict seems imminent?
Najib, between pathways and pipelines and incentives to increase oil production, is this now a point where Albertans will look past the degree of disgruntlement so many have had with the federal government?
No, one thing that Don is right about is that, this is greenwashing. Carbon capture itself and the way that it's done is just another boondoggle to transfer money to oil and gas companies. Absolutely, there is an international, a global need for Canadian oil, given something that we've manufactured, a constraint that we've manufactured, we being the West and the U.S. And interesting enough, nobody wants our bitumen except the U.S. so they can refine it and sell it to everyone. You have to remember that the real money to be made, the jobs to be created in refining, which Canada does not do in a large capacity. All we're doing is shipping bitumen to other countries to refine and benefit from. So there's so many other factors that we're being distracted from, with these things about carbon capture, and never mind the energy paradox of carbon capture itself. It's interesting that to capture carbon and to bury it requires intense heat and energy, which means more natural gas is used, who benefits from that? Oil and gas companies, right? So the whole, that's the one thing that Don is right about, the whole carbon capture idea, the whole emissions reduction, which oil and gas company haven't significantly reduced emissions per barrel in years. It's actually absolutely greenwashing.
All right. Major projects also on the front burner for First Nations leaders.
The federal government can try and set up all the timelines that they want for project approvals, but they can't put a deadline on First Nations rights, and you have rights.
The Assembly of First Nations gathering in Ottawa this week for its annual general meeting, and with the Carney government preparing further legislation to speed up major project approvals, fresh concerns being raised. The Prime Minister's promise a year ago to consult Indigenous consultations may be in question. Don, after nearly a year after the establishment of the Major Projects Office, how would you say the Carney government is faring when it comes to that promise of consulting with First Nations?
Well, it's almost like I'm going to have to repeat myself, except just change the frame of reference ever so slightly. Lots of things have happened in the last year, including what looks to be the Strait of Hormuz going to be permanently in a state of chaos. We also noticed that in Canada right now, one of the issues in terms of reserves and water on reserves is that there are over 600 plus First Nations. And at the Assembly of First Nations, there seems to be a conversation about the government's responsibility is to fix the water problem. Now, I checked in about what the water problem is. With the 600 plus First Nations, 36 have boil water advisories. All right, and please don't beat me up. I'm just reporting here, okay? I'm just saying are we talking too much about the wrong thing and not enough about the right thing? So let's just take a First Nation, Kashechewan. Where's that? It's in Ontario. It's up near James Bay. It has a perpetual problem with spring flooding. The people at Kashechewan themselves have said maybe they want to move, but nothing has happened. It's been dynamic inaction. Now, what the Carney government has done, to its credit, is starting to refocus the whole conversation and our relationships with Canada's Indians. We have an Indian Act since 1876, I think it was. I'm doing this from memory. And I think maybe we need to revisit a lot of things, just to repeat myself from a few moments ago, in a very dynamic world global conflict situation. I'll leave it at that.
Najib, while AFN leadership will be hearing from a number of federal cabinet ministers, the PM is not scheduled to speak this week. He will, however, convene a meeting of chiefs in October. How do you see that conversation playing out with timing of the assessment of the West Coast Pipeline as a project of national interest, not to mention Albertans voting on the issue of separation in the October referendum?
Yeah, I think the Assembly of First Nations is going to use this to leverage a lot of things, which they should, and I fully support that. Whether it's the pipeline or the separatist argument, they're going to use it to get what they want, and I fully think that they should. Listen, the right to clean water is enshrined in international law. It's an embarrassment to Canada that even 36 don't have are on boiled water advisories, and never mind that boiled water advisory is just one part of access to clean drinking water. It's a national embarrassment, has been for a long time. Prior to Prime Minister Carney, it's something that's easily solvable. The fact that one of the issues that the First Nations have is the wording in the new bill of progressive realization. Like, is this a joke? Progressive realization for people, for children to have clean drinking water and access to clean drinking water. We have money to subsidize oil and gas company, but we don't have money to build water treatment plants on First Nations land. This is an international embarrassment for Canada, how we treat Indigenous people, and our failure to enact the Truth and Reconciliation, our failure to enact international law for access to clean water. I mean, there's nothing else to be said about it. 36 is too much. 1 is too much. Everybody has the right to clean drinking water.
All right. Time for us to take a bit of a break. But when we come back, accountability at Calgary City Hall. Our panel on the push to establish a lobbyist registry. More in a moment. Welcome back. The Mayor of Calgary is putting the issue of accountability front and center.
If there's public money on the line and a private business entity is looking to influence city council or even city administration decision, I believe that Calgarians have a right to know that information.
Calgary City Hall hosts dozens of meetings daily, but exactly who is meeting with councillors and City Hall bureaucrats is not information made available to the public. But on Tuesday, a city committee unanimously endorsed the first step in creating a lobbyist registry that would require disclosure of who policymakers are meeting with. Najib, is there enough lobbying potentially going on behind the scenes in a city the size of Calgary to warrant this window of transparency?
Oh, absolutely there is. And I say this as someone who's done lobbying work. I don't think people realize how much lobbying is done at the municipal level. This is a no-brainer to have a lobbyist registry, either overseen by the provincial registry as is done in Quebec, or municipally as is done in Toronto, Ottawa, and other cities. We actually kind of did a trial run of it in Edmonton, where we had the mayoral registry back in 2017 or so, but it was volunteer. It wasn't something that they had to do. But we absolutely need a mandated lobbyist registry. We should have full transparency of lobbyist activities with city halls. This is something that has to be done. The power and the influence of lobbyists is only growing, and it's growing at every level of government.
Don, what does this development reflect about the current state of leadership at Calgary City Hall? How different a dynamic is this, do you think, with Jeremy Farkas in the mayor's chair?
I think it might be assigned to the day and night approach to how you do politics. The mayor that was before this one seemed to be isolated from a lot of things, including a column in the National Post that pointed out very clearly that mayor was sitting at literally several floors above the ground talking about something while on the ground there was a problem on the street. So I'm being deliberately obscure here for a reason. I think this idea of lobbyists, what do we mean by lobbyists? What is exactly a lobbyist? Well, there are profound definitions for that. If you go to Ottawa, you do have to register these kinds of things, and it's often with companies, Hill and Knowlton, no relation, by the way. But I want to extend lobbyists to advocacy. Non-government organizations, that seems like a no-brainer. But what about activists? What about activists? We seem to have a plethora of activists in Alberta right now trying to get the attention of governance at all levels. So I'm not quite sure what they mean by lobbyist in a registry. I'd like some clarity on that.
Najib, are there lessons here for the Alberta government, given it's also reviewing provincial lobbying rules, something Albertans currently have an opportunity to actually give feedback on through mid-August?
Well, let me help you understand the difference between advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy means, pushing to get laws that are already existing to be applied equally to all groups. That's activism, that's advocacy. Lobbying tries to create new laws for their clients that benefit their clients and benefit them. So that is the exact difference. And the latter thing is the thing that we have to have a transparency on and control, more so than advocacy, which is just the application of law evenly and equally across groups. This is the big difference, and this is why we need lobbying registries, because of the way that these lobbyists influence law and regulations for their clients is the one thing that we need to, Calgary doesn't even have a code of conduct for its city council, never mind a lobbying registry. So let's start there. We let them be accountable for themselves, and we've all seen how that goes.
Don, do you want one last word? 30 seconds worth?
Well, Najib and I should have a beer or something and discuss what we mean by lobbyist activism and the rest of it. And that's what it all gets down to. Your version of what I think is wrong is my version of what I think is right, and so forth. So let's have that discussion sometime over the summer. Michael, thanks for this one today. And everybody buckle up. We're about to go through some turbulence.
Yeah, weather-wise, for sure. All right, gents, we'll have to leave it there.
Anytime.
Great to see you both. Thank you.
Enjoyed it, Michael. Thanks. Nice to see you, Najib.
Great to see you guys.
Now, here are a few responses to a recent story posted by CTV News about comments from the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations on the issue of separation. Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak saying if it happens, quote, they're not taking the land with them. Brian starts us off with this. Any separatist movement needs to negotiate with Alberta First Nations. That much is certain. Basil writes, some feel it's more about kicking Ottawa out, who said the land was going anywhere. Penny thinks many Canadians stand with the Indigenous chiefs. Rachel adds, we are stronger together. And Doug says there should be no vote until everything is in writing. Have your say. Email us anytime at comments@albertaprimetime.com. Coming up tomorrow, leading CEOs and entrepreneurs in our province are giving insight into outlook and confidence in a unique new survey. And we will hear from the Business Council of Alberta on what those CEOs are saying. That's on Thursday. Until then, have a great evening, everyone, from all of us at Alberta Primetime. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time.